If that were really the case, I would tell you about it. I think you already know that my morning walks are not just for me.
Lamar froze for a moment, looking at her, feeling her words pierce him and leave a mark, as if exposing his own feelings, which he tried hard to hide even from himself.
So I'm not the only one looking for peace here.
She laughed, softly, barely perceptibly, and her laugh sounded to him like an unexpected touch, bringing him back to life.
You know the answer. We all seek peace, especially where it is most difficult to find. It's just that sometimes we don't fully realize it.
He took a step closer, his feet barely touching the ground, as if he was afraid to destroy the magic of the moment. Every morning began for him with the hope of her appearance, and now he could not believe that he was really standing here next to her.
I never thought before that a walk through the forest could bring so much. Silence. It seems easier to be yourself here.
Ida looked at him thoughtfully, her gaze was searching, as if she was trying to figure out exactly what was hidden behind his words.
Are you sure it's just the forest?
Her words touched something in his soul, and he looked away, as if he was afraid that she would read in his eyes what he did not dare to say. It seemed to him that her questions were much deeper than they seemed at first glance.
You're right. Maybe it's not just the silence of the forest. This place seems to change everything around, as if it makes you see what was hidden.
She took a step toward him, softly, almost noiselessly, and her voice sounded low, like the wind whispering among the trees.
We always see what we want to see, Lamar. And it seems you didn't come here just for peace.
His heart began to pound harder, and he was silent for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. He realized that her words had awakened a strange excitement in him, as if she saw through him, knew how he felt.
Sometimes I think you're reading my mind. It's like you know more about me than I do.
She smiled slightly, mysteriously, as if there was some secret meaning in her smile, and her eyes became even deeper, as if reflecting all the wisdom of the forest around them.
It's easier to understand the other person here. We are not just talking in words here. Sometimes silence tells more.
These words caused Lamar embarrassment, but also a strange, quiet happiness. He knew she was right, their communication needed no words, as if an invisible bond had been established between them that needed no explanation. But his desire to tell her something important, something real, was too strong for him to resist.
Have you ever felt that someone is becoming more important to you than you can afford?
Ida did not look away. Her eyes were filled with a soft light, but something else flashed in them, something warm but restrained.
We all face this sooner or later, but sometimes what seems unacceptable turns out to be what gives us strength.
A strange determination gripped him. He felt that this moment was his only chance to find out the truth, to express what tormented him, and at the same time inspired him.
Ida, since I came here, I can't get rid of the thought that you are not just my grandmother's friend.
She smiled faintly, and a sparkle flashed in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for these words. Her calmness and confidence made him feel both vulnerable and admired.
And what does that mean to you?
A fever seized him, and he realized that he could no longer hide his feelings. The words that he had been holding back all this time finally escaped his lips.
I do not know how to explain it. Every day you become something more to me. Your presence here in this forest, your words, your look, all this fills me with a feeling that I cannot escape.
Her face remained calm, but he noticed how her gaze softened, as if her heart responded to his words. There was something warm but hidden in her expression, as if she herself was trying not to succumb to these emotions.
We often don't realize what we are looking for. And perhaps meeting someone who becomes important to us always puts us in front of a choice that we did not expect.
Lamar felt that her words were an answer to his own feelings. He didn't know how far he could go, but his heart yearned to know her answer. He took another step toward her, and her breath seemed to merge with his.
I'm afraid that one day this feeling will destroy me. But at the same time, I'm afraid of losing him.
Ida looked at him without taking her eyes off him, and her gaze was full of the very warmth he craved. She seemed to accept his words as something natural, as if they had been known to her for a long time.
Maybe this feeling is not destruction, but the beginning of something new. Sometimes what we consider dangerous actually becomes something that allows us to see our own essence.
Lamar took a deep breath, realizing that he could no longer ignore his feelings. Her words made his heart skip a beat, as if she was revealing to him the truth that he had been trying to hide for so long. It seemed to him that he had finally seen what he had been looking for so long.
I can't lie to myself anymore. You are what makes my life here meaningful. You are the silence that I wanted to find so much.
Ida seemed to understand his feelings, but her face remained calm, as if she was trying to suppress her own emotions. Her voice was low, but there was a subtle tenderness in it.
You can find silence alone, Lamar. But this feeling, it's yours. It should become a part of you, no matter what connects us.
Lamar fell silent, realizing that her words did not reject him, but they did not promise anything either. Her forgiveness, her calm acceptance, was like salvation for him, but he knew that their relationship would now exist beyond words and promises. They stood opposite each other, surrounded by the forest, which seemed to have witnessed their conversation. The silence around them was filled with feelings they couldn't express, and in that silence Lamar found what he was looking for. Lamar, standing on the threshold of the morning forest, could not get rid of the feeling that his every movement and every breath was like an invisible thread connecting him to her. It was difficult to explain even to himself, but Ida became a part of his every day. He woke up early, before his grandmother, and went to the river with the only hope to meet her. These meetings, seemingly random but always exciting, were the only thing that gave his day meaning. He found her now at the bend of the path, now on the very shore, and every time his heart stopped when their eyes met. This morning was no exception. The sun's rays made their way through the crowns of the trees, laying golden stripes on the wet grass, and in this light Lamar noticed her silhouette again. She was standing a little way off the path, lost in her thoughts, and he, afraid of scaring her off, stopped and watched.
I'm sorry if I'm disturbing your morning solitude again.
Ida turned to him with a soft smile, and there was something in her gaze that he could not immediately understand, a mixture of interest and some kind of quiet, almost wise acceptance. Lamar tried to focus on his morning walks, but thoughts of her kept coming back. He tried to convince himself that their meetings were just a coincidence, that his attraction would pass like a spring storm, noisily but quickly. But these thoughts became only a weak shield against the growing interest in Ida. Every chance meeting between them, every glance of hers, or a brief exchange of words left a trace in him that did not disappear, but on the contrary became deeper and deeper. At times he held his pace, running his eyes over the space around, unconsciously looking for her among the trees or in the garden near the house. At such moments he found himself waiting for his heart to stop, and his mind was insistently telling him to stop. But Lamar couldn't. Something stronger than him, some quiet call, pushed him every day to places where he could see her. By the river, on the very path where they had first met, he now spent more time than anywhere else. It was as if he had turned into a silent observer of nature, but in fact he was attracted not by the river, not by the rustle of leaves, not by clean air, but by the thought that one day, on one of these days, Ida would pass by again. And when it really happened one day, he felt his heart stop. She walked along the path with a light gait, gliding and graceful, as if she did not touch the ground. Lamar, noticing her from afar, took a few steps towards her, but something elusive slowed him down, forcing him to stop, as if at the last moment something restrained him from haste. He stood frozen, watching Ida get closer and closer to him. He saw her face, calm and focused, her gaze fixed forward, and then their eyes met. She smiled slightly, and that look sent a wave through his body that was impossible to contain. She looked at him as if she had read his mind, as if she understood that at this moment he saw her not just as a casual acquaintance, or as a friend of his grandmother. There was no reproach in her gaze, no condemnation, but it seemed to Lamar that at that moment she saw through him. His first impulse was to leave, to hide from that penetrating gaze, but a calmness seemed to paralyze him again. They met in the middle of the path. He was almost afraid to break this silence, so full of meaning, but as always, Ida was the first to break the silence. There was a note of soft irony in her voice.
It's like you're drawn back here every morning. Maybe you found something special here.
Lamar, feeling her gaze, felt his lips involuntarily form a slight smile. She didn't ask directly, but there was a subtle hint in her voice that she knew the answer.
I don't know. It seems that this place is like a magnet. It brings peace like nothing else.
Ida tilted her head to the side, her dark eyes twinkling under the sunlight falling through the leaves. He couldn't figure out what that look of hers meant, curiosity, irony, or something else she was carefully hiding behind that expression.
You could find peace in the city. Do you really need to be here?
Her words seemed simple, but Lamar sensed a challenge in them. He didn't know how to answer this question, which revealed feelings in him that he didn't want to talk about.
Maybe I needed an excuse to stay. This place gives me a feeling that I haven't felt in a long time.
She didn't take her eyes off him. There was a quiet concentration in her eyes. He almost wanted to say more, something that would outline his inner struggle, but instead he just shrugged. Lamar realized that he was afraid to open up to her, fearing that his words would be too frank. As if admitting his feelings, he was losing something intimate. However, Ida didn't seem to need his words. She came closer, their eyes met again, and Lamar felt that, despite all the distance between them, they were closer than he had ever felt with another person. They stood there, and it seemed to Lamar that time had stopped. He saw her dark eyes, deep, as if beckoning to an unknown depth, and he was seized with a sharp feeling of longing.
Is something bothering you? Or is it just my imagination?
Her words were spoken almost in a whisper, as if she was afraid to break this tacit agreement that had been established between them. Lamar couldn't hide his emotions anymore, but he still felt the words getting stuck in his throat.
Ida, sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be here, that I'm invading your life, disturbing your peace of mind.
Ida only smiled slightly, and her gaze became softer, as if she understood his feelings and accepted them. It seemed that she could unravel his doubts, sense his anxiety.
If that were the case, I would tell you. But you're not breaking anything, Lamar. Rather, you remind me that simple meetings can be more important than words.
Her words echoed in him, as if she had pushed him to the realization he had been avoiding for so long. Lamar realized that their silence was not an emptiness, but a special form of communication filled with what both of them could not express in words. They continued walking along the path, occasionally meeting eyes, and this silence turned into something much more for him. He felt her closeness, her warmth, as if her presence was the only thing that filled his soul. He wanted to talk, but he was afraid to ruin this moment. In the end, his state of mind turned into a sweet, painful tension. Later that evening, Lamar sat on the terrace of his grandmother's house, mentally replaying their conversation. He was aware that Ida knew more than she was saying, that her words were heartfelt and filled with understanding. She sensed his confusion and accepted him as he was. He felt scared, because every time he saw her, their connections became more and more significant, as if it was his inevitable vocation to strive for her, to stay close, even if it would lead him to the edge. And again the morning came. Again Lamar felt an unbearable desire to see her inside himself, although he knew perfectly well that this would only complicate his own experiences. They met again by the river, and Ida, with the same calm expression on her face, walked towards him, not hiding her confidence. This time they stood on the shore, silently watching the reflection of the trees and the water that flowed past, unhurriedly and calmly.
Tell me, have you ever felt that you are attracted to something or someone, even if you understand that it is unreasonable?
She gave him a long, attentive look, and her face became serious. She understood his question, his uncertainty and fear.
Yes, it happened. Sometimes life confronts us with people who evoke something important in us. Even if we know that such feelings should not go further, they may be necessary for us.
These words startled Lamar. Ida did not turn away, she answered honestly, but her eyes remained closed for understanding, as if she did not want to show how she felt. In her words, he heard some hint that her own feelings for him might not be so simple.
I'm afraid that one day I'll do something that I'll regret. But when I'm with you, it seems to me that this is the right thing to do.
Ida looked down and smiled, but in her smile there was a shadow of sadness.
Maybe it's true. Maybe all we have to do is go for what feels right, even if it hurts.
Lamar didn't know what to say. Her words pierced him like a cold wind, but he understood that this was their reality. Silence and understanding mixed with a feeling they both tried to deny. The evenings at his grandmother's house were a challenge for Lamar. Every time he was with her, he felt the weight of guilt filling him with the realization that something more than just friendship was being formed between him and Ida. It seemed to him that he noticed an invisible knowledge in her gaze, as if his grandmother suspected something, but he did not dare to ask her directly. This indecision gave rise to anxiety in him, but he remained silent, afraid to break the calm relationship that had been between them since childhood. Grandma was a wise and patient woman. Her kind eyes did not express the slightest hint of suspicion or jealousy, but it seemed that her intuition, accumulated over the years, sees through her grandson. There was endless love and care in her light smile and warm gestures with which she surrounded Lamar, and every time he felt like a traitor who allowed his feelings for her friend to flare up so uncontrollably. From morning to evening, he tried to immerse himself in simple things to distract himself from his thoughts. He cleaned the yard, helped his grandmother with the housework, went out into the forest for firewood. But his attention involuntarily returned each time to those meetings by the river, to Ida's fleeting glances, and to the silence filled with a special meaning. The internal struggle became more and more palpable for him. He knew that he felt something more than just an ordinary attraction to Ida, but he couldn't admit it to himself either. How could he allow himself such thoughts when every evening his grandmother, with whom he was so close, looked at him with trust? One day during dinner, Grandma, while serving food, said that Ida was inviting them to her house for dinner. This news took him by surprise. His grandmother's familiar voice and her sincere joy puzzled him. Lamar felt something twitch inside, as if his secret was about to be revealed. Grandma also offered to take a small gift with her to bake a pie that they could bring to Ida. Lamar couldn't refuse, because that would be too suspicious. His whole being protested, but he nodded, knowing that he could not refuse. He felt strangely restless all day, and his grandmother, on the contrary, was cheerfully busy in the kitchen, as if it were an ordinary event. Her joy and kindness only increased his guilt. He imagined the evening at Ida's, the moment when he would see her again, but now not alone, but in the presence of his grandmother, and this thought haunted him. It seemed to him that every glance, every smile of Ida would cause new waves of embarrassment in him, which he would not be able to hide. The evening came quickly, and Lamar, trying to hide his excitement, followed his grandmother when they went to Ida's house. Her cozy home, impregnated with a slight smell of fresh herbs and flowers, greeted them warmly and cordially. Ida, in a simple but elegant dress, came out to them with a soft smile, and her gaze, which met Lamar's, awakened in him the very feelings that he was so desperately trying to get rid of. She greeted them with such ease that for a moment it seemed to him that everything that was happening was just a figment of his imagination, that his feelings for her were nothing more than a delusion. They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed smoothly about everyday affairs, about the garden, about the past summer, about the coming cold weather. Ida seemed to speak simply, with restraint, but her every word, every look made Lamar feel uncomfortable. He was afraid that his grandmother would notice this, that she would sense something strange in their communication, catch the invisible connection that had arisen between him and Ida. However, Grandma, immersed in conversation, was discussing with Ida with lively interest her new plans for the garden, and Lamar relaxed a little, feeling that his worries might be just a figment of his imagination. At some point, Ida got up to pour tea, and her light movements again attracted Lamar's attention. Her graceful gait, as always, was imbued with that elusive confidence and calmness that attracted him so much. He could feel the tension growing inside him again, and he tried to hide it by focusing on his grandmother's conversation. But his attention kept returning to Ida. One glance from her, one casual movement, was enough for him to lose his composure again. This evening turned out to be a test for him, which he barely survived. Every time his gaze fell on Ida, he felt an irresistible longing awaken in him, a desire that he could not speak out loud. He looked at his grandmother, her face full of kindness and love, and realized that he had to fight this feeling, suppress it, but his heart no longer obeyed his mind. He felt something inside him tearing apart, as he was attracted to Ida more and more, and despite all his attempts to cope with himself, he realized that he could no longer ignore his feelings. After that evening, Lamar tried to avoid grandmother's questions, although he understood that she might suspect something. Her gazes became more intense, sometimes lingering on him longer than usual. At such moments he felt awkward and left under the pretext of some business, just to avoid making eye contact with her. This secrecy was destroying him from the inside, but he did not find the strength to open up. Lamar understood that he had gone too far, that his feelings for Ida had become something inevitable for him, but he could not leave his grandmother, who sincerely believed in his honesty and devotion. Every day Lamar felt more and more clearly that his feelings for Ida could not be suppressed. They grew like a flame that could not be extinguished. His affection for his grandmother held him back, but he knew that sooner or later this internal struggle would find its resolution. He could leave, go back to the city, leaving behind this rural idyll and his impossible love. But the thought of returning to the city seemed unbearable to him. Now that he has met Ida, his former life has lost its appeal, has become something distant and meaningless. In the evenings he went to the river and sat on the shore for a long time, watching the water, trying to find inner peace. But these walks, instead of calming him down, only increased his confusion. In every shadow of the trees he saw her image, in the rustle of the leaves he heard her voice. His thoughts kept returning to Ida, and he could no longer imagine a morning without her presence, without a chance meeting on the path or at her house. His whole life here at his grandmother's house was now permeated with her image, and the more he tried to get rid of these thoughts, the more they took hold of him. Every morning, starting from the moment he got out of bed, Lamar felt that his day was filled with anticipation of meeting Ida again. He couldn't control his excitement. Every step he took was directed at her, to the moment when he would see her again and be able to meet her gaze for at least a moment. These feelings became something unbearable for him, but he could not find a way to get rid of them. It seemed to him that Ida saw his struggle, that she understood what feelings he had for her, but she did not say anything, remaining the same calm and detached. Her silence was unbearable for him, but at the same time it gave him a space in which he could feel safe. He knew that her tacit acceptance allowed him to be honest with himself without needing explanations or words. With each new meeting, their silent communication became deeper. They didn't need words to understand each other, and Lamar felt that this invisible connection was the only thing that supported him in this internal struggle. Their silence became a shelter for him, in which he could hide his feelings without fear of condemnation. Grandma seemed to see that something had changed in Lamar. She looked at him more and more often, with a slight reproach in her eyes, as if waiting for some explanation from him. He knew he couldn't hide his feelings anymore, but the fear of destroying what they had was holding him back. His grandmother became a part of his life for him. Her support and care were what he built his relationship with the world on, and he was afraid that the truth might ruin it all. Lamar felt that every day he was here was a step towards an inevitable choice. His feelings for Ida became a painful shadow for him, which he could not banish from his life, and his relationship with his grandmother became part of this shadow. He realized that he would not be able to hide his feelings for long, that sooner or later he would have to make a decision and either stay or leave. Every evening, returning home, Lamar felt his love for Ida growing stronger, and he could no longer hide it from himself. With each passing day, the internal conflict in Lamar's soul became more painful. Ida occupied all his thoughts, and he could no longer deny that this feeling had completely engulfed him. But every time he thought about her, he felt a tight loop of guilt tightening around his heart. It seemed to him that he was betraying his grandmother, who surrounded him with care and trust. This woman, who had always been by his side, now became an involuntary obstacle for him, as if her presence alone kept him on the edge, which he did not dare to step over. Lamar could almost physically feel his soul being torn apart by two strong feelings: affection for his grandmother and an impossible attraction to Ida. It was a strange, painful contradiction, as if he was between two worlds, each of which called to him, but neither of them allowed him to find peace. His life turned into an expectation. Every morning began with the hope of seeing Ida, and the evening ended with remorse when he looked at his grandmother, who still remained for him the embodiment of wisdom and warmth. He tried to convince himself that his feelings for Ida were just a fleeting attraction caused by temporary intimacy, that as soon as he returns to the city, all this will disappear, and his life will return to its former course. But the more he tried to suppress his emotions, the stronger the attraction became, as if resistance only increased the internal tension. In the moments when he stood by the river or strolled along familiar paths, his heart desperately longed for her quiet, confident presence, for her gaze in which, as it seemed to him, the whole world was reflected. Over time, Lamar began to avoid his grandmother, as if her presence increased his torment. He felt that every touch of hers, every warm look, reminded him that he was keeping a secret from her that would not leave him alone. Having dinner with her was a challenge. He avoided her gaze, tried not to engage in conversation, and most often was dissuaded by fatigue, after which he quickly retreated, trying to find at least a little privacy. Grandma seemed to feel something but didn't ask. She just continued to look at him with the same warmth and understanding, which only increased his inner torment. Every time Lamar returned from a meeting with Ida, he felt a sharp sense of guilt. It was like a forbidden fruit sweet, but poisoning his soul. He understood that this secret fire that burned his heart could not exist next to his grandmother, that her presence in itself rejected his feelings, as if her wisdom and steadfastness opposed his weakness. He was thinking more and more often that perhaps the only way to get rid of this pain was to just leave everything behind and try to forget Ida. But the thought was becoming unbearable for him. He knew he couldn't leave her, couldn't leave this village soaked in her image. Sometimes he tried to imagine what would happen if his grandmother found out the truth. He saw her disappointment, the heaviness in her eyes that would tell him about betrayal. And this picture became a real nightmare for him. His grandmother was always an example of strength and perseverance for him. She was the one who supported him when everything seemed lost. And now, by violating her trust, he felt that he was betraying her love, her faith in him. He began to notice that his grandmother sometimes sighed softly in his presence, as if her heart was gripped by a vague premonition. She didn't say anything, but her silence seemed to be filled with an understanding that she didn't want to put into words. This silence weighed on Lamar even more, as if the invisible bond between them was beginning to collapse under the weight of his secrets. It seemed to him that every evening they spent together brought the moment of truth closer, when he would have to reveal the whole truth to his grandmother. Sometimes he would sit alone for a long time in the garden, far from home, peering into the dark crowns of the trees. It seemed to him that this silence of nature was the only place where he could be honest with himself without fear of condemnation. At these moments he was tormented by the thought that he would no longer be able to remain in the shadows, that his feelings for Ida would become obvious, and he would not be able to hide anything. He understood that sooner or later this passion would break out, destroying his calm, familiar life. When Lamar faced Ida, it became a celebration and torture for him at the same time. She was still looking at him with a slight smile, and there was that calmness and restraint in her eyes that he had never seen in other women. She seemed unaffected by his torment, although he sometimes noticed something in her gaze that made his heart beat faster. Ida understood that something more was growing between them, but her behavior remained unchanged. This confidence of hers, her ability to keep her distance, delighted him and at the same time caused him pain. And on nights when he couldn't sleep, Lamar often replayed the moments he spent with Ada. Her every glance, every casual touch was imprinted in his mind, becoming a source of inspiration and fear for him. He understood that there was more than just friendship in those moments, but still he couldn't bring himself to take a step that would change everything. He was tormented by conflicting feelings. On the one hand, he wanted to open up to her, tell her about what was boiling in his soul, and on the other hand, he understood that this would mean the end of the connection that he had so carefully guarded. His whole life turned into a painful expectation. He lived from one meeting with Ida to another, feeling more and more that this feeling was becoming a necessity for him. He knew that these meetings could not be continued, that he had to find the strength to stop, but despite all his efforts, he continued to look for her gaze, hoping for a chance meeting, for her silent smile. Every morning began with the thought that he would see her again, and this hope became for him something akin to salvation, but also a source of unbearable tension. With the onset of cold weather, when the trees lost their leaves and the days became shorter, Lamar felt that his inner conflict was escalating. Now that the house and garden looked empty and silent, his feeling for Ida seemed to him even more acute and contradictory. He went into the woods more and more often, hoping that physical fatigue would drown out his thoughts, but this only briefly distracted him from the storm that was raging inside. The less opportunity there was to meet Ida, the more his heart yearned for her. Every morning he felt that his days here were limited, that he would have to leave soon, but this thought became almost painful for him. How could he just leave it all behind? How could he leave knowing that he would never see her again? It seemed to him that every day his love for Ida became something inevitable, like breathing, and now she filled his life, leaving no room for other feelings. This bond between them, however tacit, was becoming a salvation for him that he could not afford. From time to time, when he was with his grandmother, it seemed to him that she already guessed about his feelings. She sometimes looked at him with a slight sadness, as if she was trying to understand what was going on in his soul, but did not ask questions. This unspoken understanding was a painful reminder for Lamar that he would not be able to hide forever. He knew that one day he would have to make a choice, and that choice would have consequences that he could not predict. Increasingly, he was gripped by a strange feeling that he was living on the edge between a dream and reality, that his life had turned into a mirage that could disappear at any moment. He tried to find solace in everyday activities, but even the simplest activities, like gardening or taking care of the house, could not distract his thoughts. It seemed to him that his every step, every movement brought him closer to the inevitable decision. But he did not know how to accept it. Gradually, Lamar began to realize that he could no longer avoid his grandmother, that her kindness and love were the only things that kept him from utter despair. But at the same time, he realized that the truth would come out anyway, that his feelings for Ida could not be hidden. And even though his heart went out to her, he knew that every time they met, it was the last reminder for him that he was on the brink. This double life, filled with hidden feelings and inner tension, became unbearable for him. In recent days, Lamar has increasingly felt the inevitability of an upcoming conversation with his grandmother. He could no longer evade her gaze, filled with patience and tenderness, but now with a hint of barely perceptible understanding. It seemed to him that her every glance and soft smile told him that she already guessed his secret feelings for Ida, that her patience was just a silent request to be honest. Her motionless calmness weighed on him, making him feel even more guilty and confused. He understood that his grandmother expected the truth from him, but he was afraid to destroy her faith in him. Every time he tried to talk to his grandmother about his feelings, the words stuck in his throat, preventing them from escaping. He already knew that he couldn't hide it from her for long, that the silence had become unbearable for him, but the fear of her reaction held him down. He couldn't help but think that her friendship with Ida wasn't just a casual acquaintance. These were years of trust, endless conversations, joys and sorrows that they shared with each other, maintaining a connection that went deeper than ordinary human attachments. Lamar felt that with his confession he was invading this long-standing, time-honored friendship, destroying something important and intimate. His anxiety grew by the minute. He felt like a stranger in his own home, where everything reminded him of the simple and familiar days when his life was defined and calm. His grandmother's care and tolerance now turned into a source of painful shame for him. And her presence in the house, her willingness to forgive any weakness of his, pushed him even more to the need for recognition. Every dinner, every conversation together about simple things turned into torture for him. He could barely look at his grandmother, feeling that he was holding something inside him that could destroy their unity. One day, waking up in the early morning, he decided to spend the day alone to try to collect his thoughts. All day he wandered through the forest, going deeper and deeper, trying to regain his mental balance. But this journey only increased his confusion. It seemed to him that the forest surrounding him was a reflection of his inner state, dense, confusing, full of dark shadows, among which he could not find a way out. He knew that he could no longer live with this oppressive feeling, that his confession would be an inevitable step towards liberation. When he returned home, he found his grandmother busy with the usual evening chores, and felt afraid again. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't afford to hide the truth any longer. Now he felt that every evening they spent together, every casual touch or glance, was becoming more and more unbearable, that their common life here, in the silence of the village house, had become a trap for him. Lamar realized that silence is no longer a defense, but has become a barrier that separates him and his grandmother. He spent the next day anxiously waiting. The words he wanted to say to his grandmother were endlessly spinning in his head, but each of them seemed to him not strong enough to express everything that was happening inside him. He imagined her expression, her silent look when she found out the truth, and his heart ached. Lamar understood that his confession could be a blow to her, that his grandmother might not be able to accept his feelings for Ida, but he knew that it was impossible to hide it further. By evening he felt that the time had come. They sat down at the table, and Grandma, noticing his tension, looked at him with a quiet kindness that was like a knife blade to him. Her eyes, full of understanding, seemed to say to him, "I'm waiting." Lamar understood that there was no point in dragging it out any further. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed to him that she could hear every beat of it, but he gathered all his strength to finally speak the truth that burned inside him. The words came out unevenly, intermittently. He could not find the right phrases, and his grandmother silently looked at him. There was neither condemnation nor surprise in her gaze, only quiet understanding. He tried to explain to her that his feelings for Ida were not just a passing infatuation, that this woman had become for him someone who brought him back to life, who filled his soul with the meaning he had been looking for so long. He admitted that he could not suppress this feeling, that every day of their meetings became a salvation for him, but also a torment. As he said this, he felt like he was relieving himself of the weight that lay on his heart. He knew that this moment would be a turning point for him, that his relationship with his grandmother would no longer be the same, that he would no longer be able to live in her house as before. Her forgiveness, her acquiescence was the only possible outcome he had hoped for. He knew that it could break the bond that united them, but now the truth was more important to him. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. Lamar couldn't look up, expecting the worst. It seemed to him that the silence stretched for an eternity, that every moment of it became a test, but he felt his grandmother come up to him and just put her hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it had everything he was afraid of losing. Lamar felt her support and pain at the same time, as if her touch was both forgiveness and bitterness at the same time. Her eyes remained calm, but there was a glint of sadness in them that he couldn't help but notice. He understood that her forgiveness was an act of love that was not easy for her. Her wisdom and patience were like an anchor in the sea for him, which did not allow him to get lost, and now he felt that he had betrayed that trust. But there was that calmness in her eyes that he appreciated so much, and it comforted him, as if, despite everything, she accepted his choice. Grandma was silent for a long time before she spoke, and there was no anger or disappointment in her voice, only a quiet sadness. She said that Ida was her friend, a reliable support, the person with whom she shared the joys and difficulties for many years. But as always, her words were not a reproach, just a gentle reminder of how much she trusted both him and Ida. Lamar knew that her acceptance was not an easy decision, that there was pain behind her words, but it was also a testament to the love she gave him unconditionally. That night was a moment of liberation and sadness for him. He understood that now their relationship with his grandmother had changed, that her forgiveness gave him the right to follow his feelings, but at the same time imposed on him a new responsibility. He knew that their conversation had left a wound in his grandmother's heart, but he was grateful for her wisdom and fortitude. Now he had to meet Ida with the understanding that his love for her had become part of his past and future, part of the world that he and his grandmother shared. After a difficult conversation with his grandmother, Lamar felt as if he was liberated, but at the same time devastated. He no longer felt the weight of the mystery, was not constrained by her silent understanding, and did not hide from her gaze. Her forgiveness had given him the right to his own feelings, but now a new reality was opening up in front of him, in which he had to accept his choice and, perhaps, build another life. He no longer had anything to hide, either from his grandmother or from himself. He felt a strange calmness mixed with a subtle sadness. The realization that their relationship with his grandmother had changed forever added a touch of bitterness to his joy. In the following days, Lamar became more and more drawn to solitude. He went to the river, took a long walk through the forest, allowed himself to stop and think. He understood that talking to his grandmother was just the beginning of a journey, the beginning of something that did not have precise outlines. He had to sort out his own feelings, accept them as something true and important, which now not only defined his life, but also changed it. He knew that the past would now remain in the past, but despite this, he felt that everything that had happened had left an imprint on him that he would never be able to erase. Now his thoughts kept returning to Ida, and every day he felt her image come to life in his mind. She became something immutable for him, that bright memory that attracted him and at the same time scared him. He thought about what their meeting would look like, what she would say when she found out that his feelings were not just a fleeting infatuation, but a deep affection that made her a part of his life. Lamar knew that a difficult conversation was ahead of him, which should either bring them closer or put an end to it. In the evening, he finally decided to go to Ida's. He felt that this conversation would be no less important to him than the revelation in front of his grandmother, but despite his excitement, he needed this release. He knew that if he didn't talk to her, his doubts and hopes would remain just phantoms, a shadow on the wall. As he approached her house, he felt strangely calm, as if everything he had to say had already been decided, and he only had to say it out loud. When Ida opened the door for him, he saw a slight surprise in her eyes, but also a warmth that immediately filled his heart. Lamar felt that this evening would be something special for them, a moment when they could finally talk honestly about what had happened between them, without hiding behind silence and without looking away. He greeted her with restraint, trying to hide his excitement, but Ida seemed to understand everything and invited him in. They were sitting opposite each other in her small living room, surrounded by candlelight, which gave everything a certain mystery. Ida looked at him calmly. There was a calm readiness in her gaze, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, just like him. Their conversation was unhurried, filled with that deep, almost invisible intimacy that could only arise between people who had long understood each other without words. Lamar began to talk about how he felt her presence in his life, how her calm and confident gaze became something unchangeable for him, as if he found in her eyes what he had been looking for all his life. He talked about how meeting her changed him, made him reconsider his existence and realize that she had become a part of himself. The words were simple, but Ida seemed to accept each of them with the calmness that had always been characteristic of her. She listened without interrupting, but her eyes reflected the depth of feelings that she hid, leaving behind her usual smile and calmness. When Lamar told her about his feelings, about how he woke up every morning thinking about her, Ida only nodded slightly, as if it was something she knew and felt. He realized that her silence was not only a manifestation of wisdom for him, but also an understanding that some feelings cannot be expressed in words. Her acceptance of his words was for him the confirmation he had been waiting for, the sign that his love for her was not just a figment of his imagination. When the silence between them became deep and complete, Lamar felt his heart filled with peace. Ida, who had remained a mystery and a source of inspiration for him, now revealed to him what he had always been looking for, but could not fully realize. He realized that her image was something more than he could have imagined. She became for him a symbol of the freedom he sought, and her presence, her acceptance of his feelings gave him strength. After this meeting, his soul found peace. He felt that now that there were no barriers between them, his feelings for her had become not just a passion, but something real, pure and deep. He knew that their bond would remain with him, no matter how their future lives turned out. Ida has become something for him that he will not be able to forget, and this memory will always accompany him. They didn't talk about the future, they didn't make plans. Their meeting was the end of the internal struggle that had lasted for so long. Lamar knew that their connection would exist beyond time and place, that she was a part of his soul that he could no longer neglect. Their silence was like a promise made by the heart itself, and that was enough. Now, returning to his grandmother, he felt strangely light. He realized that his conversation with Ida was not a farewell, but rather a finding of the truth that they had both been walking towards all this time. His grandmother greeted him at home with the same wise kindness as always, and Lamar realized that her silence was the blessing that allowed him to discover this love. Several days passed and Lamar was preparing to leave. His soul found peace, and now he knew that he could return to his life in the city, preserving the warmth of this love and the connection that would remain with him forever. Grandma, saying goodbye to him, looked at him with the expression that he will always remember. There was understanding and boundless kindness in her eyes. Lamar left the village, but his heart remained full. Now he knew that Ida would always be with him, a part of his soul, a part of the world he had found thanks to his grandmother. She became for him the shadow that guides him, reminding him of that freedom, of that love that remains even when all the words have already been said.